From the
I don't know what to say. I'm just speechless.
To the
I can't believe it.
we see all sorts of life-changing moments at McKinney Competitions. How would you react? Cars, houses, tech bundles and more from just £2 a ticket. No purchase necessary. For competitions, rules and conditions, see mckinneycompetitions.com.
Crime writers write about terrible, terrible things happening to people, but in person they're always, almost without exception, very, very, very friendly, very nice people.
So that's like the opposite of what you'd expect. Is like comedians not really being funny.
Yeah.
They say.
The crime writers don't often actually really kill people. And the idea of the arts as a living was seen as fantasy stuff. You know, people from here don't make a living in the arts. No, they don't. Nobody does that for a living. But when I think about it now, I come from Armagh, and I think of people of my generation from the Armagh area that have gone on to make a living. I know more people that have gone on to make a living in the arts than I do that went on to become doctors or lawyers. I often find sometimes my short stories be a lot darker than the novels are, because you can go places where maybe a reader wouldn't follow you. In a novel, they will for a short story because they don't have to sort of marry themselves in it for so long. It kind of took on a life of its own then. Pretty much every literary festival we wound up playing at over a few years, which culminated in us playing in Glastonbury.
That was the voice of one of Ireland's finest modern writers, and he was born and bred right here in Armagh. Since his first crime novel, The Ghosts of Belfast, or The 12 as it's also known, Stuart Neville has been wowing critics, readers and his peers. John Connolly and James Elroy count themselves amongst his fans. This is your host Elaine Ingram, and for this week's podcast I spoke to Stuart about his recent book of short stories, The Traveller, his upcoming novel House of Ashes, his musical endeavours with his band Fun-Loving Crime Writers, and a whole lot more.
Hello, Stuart. It's really, really nice to meet you. I can see you're sitting there in your office surrounded by guitars. And we can talk a bit about that later. But first of all, the first thing I want to ask you is about, I'm just after finishing The Traveller. And I have to say, I was just so impressed by it. Your book of short stories, which was just out last year. And, you know, the atmosphere that you create throughout is just brilliant. And the introduction by John Connolly, says it all. He was really impressed by you, and he tells the story of how he met you when you gave him your very first novel, which is The 12, or The Ghosts of Belfast, which is also known as. So he gave the perspective of how he met you, and you handed him your manuscript after a book event, and he didn't have a clue who you were. You were, you know, just an aspiring novelist, I guess, at that stage. And that was in, I think, 2009. So could you tell us a little bit about that from your perspective?
Yeah, that was in Dunleary, and I had my publishing deal at that point, but the book was a long way off coming out, and it was the Dublin Literary Festival, and they had a crime strand that was being run in Dunleary, and I'd gone down to it, and it was the first crime writing festival I'd ever been to, and I really didn't know what to expect. I had some brushes with the film business and went to the Galway Film Festival some years ago with a film and found it the most hostile, unfriendly, unwelcoming environment. So I was kind of expecting something like that. And John was one of the first people I spoke to, and he was so lovely and kind and welcoming, as was everybody else, that it was such a relief to find people who are actually friendly and welcomed a new writer into this what I found since is a very collegiate, very friendly scene. And John himself has been immensely kind to me over the years, starting with reading that book. And I think, as John points out in that introduction, it's a real sort of stomach-dropping moment when another writer, an unknown writer, tries to hand you a manuscript. Because, you know, we all have the set line, which is my agent doesn't allow me to read anything else by other people. Which, first of all, is true, but also is usually a handy kind of get out for these things. But John probably against his better instincts, read the book anyway. And
yeah, he said he felt a bit guilty. He was sitting there, a weight in his hands. He said, "You must have given him those sad eyes."
I think I did. I know I was incredibly nervous at the time. I think I was shaking.
He said
quite
you were
badly
very personable, yeah.
But that whole weekend in Dunleary was my first event of any kind that I was able to go to, that I could claim to be a writer. And I met a lot of people that weekend, including Brian McGilloway and Arlene Hunt and Declan Burke, Declan Hughes, all these Irish writers. And as I say, they were so welcoming into this scene that I assumed to be kind of like a closed kind of club, but it wasn't. Everybody was very open, very friendly, and they seemed genuinely pleased to see a new face. And that's been my experience of crime fiction in general, is that crime writers write about terrible, terrible things happening to people, but in person they're always, almost without exception, very, very, very friendly, very nice people.
So that's like the opposite of what you'd expect. Is like comedians not really being funny.
Yeah.
As they say.
Crime writers don't often actually really kill people.
But were you expecting him to? Did you just hand it to him then and just kind of think, well, that's the end of that, or were you really hopeful that he would look at it? I mean, and then when he did read it, he said immediately, like, this is the best Irish crime book that I've ever read.
I didn't know what to expect. Again, particularly as a very much a newcomer at that time, I really didn't know if or when or what would happen if you'd read it or not. And I certainly didn't expect the reaction I'd actually got from him. And I know he started handing it around to other people then to encourage other people to read it. And he was incredibly supportive at that part of my career, and has been ever since. But particularly around when I was starting off, he was one of those people who really held a hand out to me. He's one of the kindest people that you'll meet within crime fiction. I hesitate to use the word nice, because nice can be faked, but I don't think kindness can be faked, if that makes sense. Yeah. Whereas John is genuinely kind. And not just to me, but I think to all writers that he encounters. He's one of those people that didn't lift the ladder up behind him.
Yeah. And it was hugely successful. I mean, you won awards, the LA Times Awards, and for the best book, and the New York Times, the Boston Globe. Particularly, obviously, it seems in America really, really took off everywhere. But I mean, it's probably a hard market to crack now over there. But do you think because of the subject matter, because it's not something that's written about very much, Irish crime noir, which was very, very, very much steeped in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, and that went down very well over in America?
I think a lot of it was due to timing. I think I was a bit lucky with for the most part, the Irish American audience embraced that book.
Yeah,
and then that had kind of a ripple effect out to the wider crime audience. So I think in many respects it was luck in having the right book at the right time in America, when people were opening up to stories from other places, and I was kind of riding a wave of Irish crime fiction at that time. So its audiences there very much took to it, more so probably than they did on this side of the Atlantic. But I've talked about this quite a lot about this in other interviews. Northern Irish fiction, in the title of the book was changed to the 12.
Well, yeah, that's the thing I was going to ask you about. Yeah, because it wouldn't have gone down as well here, because people would just tend to.
And this is something I started to kind of push back against as a writer, because I feel it's quite discriminatory. I used to accept it as a commercial reality, but I don't anymore. But it was actually Colin Bateman, another local writer, who said to me long before it happened, we're sitting having a pint somewhere, and he said to me, they're not going to let you keep the title, you know that? And I said, Ghosts of Belfast. He said, yeah, Untitled Belfast on the cover of the book here. I didn't pay much attention at the time. He turned out to be absolutely right. It was a quiet word was had in the run up to the publication in this side of the Atlantic that they didn't want Belfast on the cover. So the title was changed to 12. Was that
purely for commercial reasons?
Purely for commercial reasons. It's fair enough. It's based in reality, in that at that time, certainly there was an antipathy towards fiction set in Northern Ireland. and oddly, nowhere more so than Northern Ireland itself. So at the time, I reluctantly accepted the change. And if you read the back cover of the book as it was published in the UK at the time, you would have no idea it was set in Belfast.
Yeah.
That was really buried. And through most of my books with my previous publisher, the setting of Northern Ireland was quietly kind of glossed over. Whereas in America, the Northern Ireland setting was seen as a selling point.
Yeah.
It was how the book was pushed and why it sold there. And again, at the time I accept that, but I don't accept that now. And I feel that it might have been a commercial reality, but it was based on prejudice.
Yeah.
And there's another way to dress that up. And I've come to the feeling now that a publisher should be challenging prejudice rather than pandering to it.
Mm-hmm.
So my next novel upcoming is out in February.
House of Ashes.
House of Ashes. It's very proudly Northern Irish. Couldn't be more Northern Irish if I tried. And I don't want to hide that anymore. And I think it's time publishing as an industry stopped the tendency towards, I'll call it regionalism, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
There was a time, I'm very good friends with Val McDermott, for example, and there was a time she was told that they couldn't sell Scottish crime fiction. Nobody wants to buy books set in Scotland, she was told.
But do you think this
would
it's
become hugely successful? So.
Do you think it would be different now, though? Because Northern Irish crime seems to be having a moment in terms of television procedural, crime procedural dramas and things like that, the likes of Line of Duty and Bloodlands and all that. So it seems to be having a moment. Do you think if that book had been published now, there would have been a different reaction and you would have been able to keep the title?
Possibly. It's kind of a complicated question. I do think there's been a shift. There has been a change. And I think a watershed moment was The Fall a few years back. We've since been sticking with TV drama or TV programs. We've had Dairy Girls. We've had, as you say, Line of Duty. It's the idea of Northern Ireland as a setting for stories that aren't necessarily about the Troubles. I think it's becoming more accepted, and I think a lot of those walls have been broken down. Within the literary scene, you've also got Milkman winning the Booker Prize, a book that's very, very Northern Irish again, written with an accent. So I do think things are opening out, and I think the market is maybe more open now. And I think, I'm trusting my new publisher to, now that sort of rock has been started to roll a little bit, they'll maybe keep pushing at it and try and get that acceptance. And I do think things are more open now. The only thing is, I don't think I would write The Ghost of Belfast today, which is the other side of that question. It was very much a book of its moment. Yeah. It was written in the spring of 2007. When it was written against the backdrop of the St. Andrews Agreement being thrashed out, and the idea of the political situation here going from completely hopeless to actually having some chink of light in the coming in with the Stormont being reestablished and so on. So the book was written against that backdrop, and it's very much of that moment. So I don't think I would write that book.
Yeah, I mean, it's very
in 2021,
because there are references to everything that was going on at the time in the book. So I suppose, it would definitely have to be a different book if you were to write it now. But your new book, tell us a little bit about House of Ashes. Tell us a bit about that, your new book, and when is it going to be out? And it's coming out next year.
Well, it's actually out in Ireland. It's coming out in America on the 7th of September. But I think it's going to come out in Ireland actually around the same time.
Okay.
So Eason's, what they call the export edition, which should be going to Eason's and the airports and so on, should have that in early September. I'm not sure if it'll be available in the northern branches of, say, Waterstones and supermarkets, because that will be tied with the hardback publication in February of next year. But yeah, it'll be creeping out from about September onwards. Anyway, it's set in rural Northern Ireland. In my mind, it's somewhere around kind of Dollingstown, Waringstown, that sort of area, County Armagh. An isolated farmhouse. The house is called the Ashes. It's set amongst ash trees, so the house is called the Ashes. And a young English woman moves there with her husband. She's called Sarah Keane, after she's had a breakdown, as described. we later found out that was actually a suicide attempt.
Right.
And her husband, who's from this area, moves them back to this isolated farmhouse. As the story progresses, we realise that this isn't a healthy relationship, that it's a coercive, controlling relationship that she's kind of held under. And another story runs parallel. After they move in, a few days after they move in, there's a knocking at the door early one morning, and it's an elderly woman at the door, screaming, "This is her house, and why are they in her house? They have to get out of her house, and where are her children?" And the story then moves back and forth between two times. There's another story then runs parallel, set in around 1959, 1960, of this elderly woman as a child, Mary, living as a prisoner in this house.
So do you have the supernatural touch in here as well, that you have tendency to mixing your genres?
Yeah, Mary keeps referring to the children that live in the house. But as far as we know, Mary's the only child that's there, but yet she knows of other children that are there. So that's thread of three. And we see these two stories interleave and develop. And Sarah finds out that something terrible happened in this house 60 years before that involved Mary, and she tries to find out what went on. And and the story develops, and these two women sort of develop a bond. And we see how Sarah finds the strength to fight back against her abuser, and how Mary finally finds the space to tell her story, what happened to her 60 years ago. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it now. I mean, the reviews have been fantastic. You already have one review calling it your masterpiece. So, that's something to definitely look forward to. You do have it. You have these themes going through your books. There's a lot of domestic abuse and darkness, and things like that. Where does that come from? That you write like that, and you write so well from the perspective of women and children, especially that first story in The Traveller. I don't think I've ever read such a harrowing, from the point of view of a very, very small child, domestic abuse. And it's just written so beautifully. How do you find that, writing like that?
I don't know. I think writers, to an extent, are kind of like method actors, in that you have to kind of inhabit the character that you're writing. You do have to see, or try and see the world and perceive the world as they do.
Yeah.
And there are quite a few in that collection, The Traveller. There are several stories from the point of view of children.
Yeah.
I don't know. I find I've always been able to do that, to sort of slip into that kind of viewpoint. And just knowing how resilient children are, and how
that child in that first story, he was just so. It was what it was. It's unconditional love, and it's just acceptance of the world the way it is. And it's all the minutiae and the little details that really just bring it. You can really feel that that's the way children see things. But to be able to write that.
Well, I think the approach I've always taken for any character is to see the world as they see it, and let them behave as they would within that world. And that doesn't matter whether it's a mass murderer or a very innocent child. If you let that character just be who they are in the story, it's not that difficult to maintain that. And the thing that strikes me about particularly children in abnormal situations, they accept abnormality as normal.
Yeah.
And just and any of us who grew up in Northern Ireland through the 70s and 80s, we just accepted soldiers on the streets, checkpoints, barriers, all that stuff that happened. When I was a kid, all the things I saw when I was a kid, you just accept it and go on about your life. It's and that's there are a few lines in The House of Ashes from Mary as a child's point of view, talking about the abnormality of her situation, and she says, "I never knew any different. That's just the way it was."
Yeah, I did read an excerpt from it. Yeah, and you could see that it was just saying it factually. Yeah,
and I think very often children, unfortunately, in those terrible situations, they have a remarkable ability to just get on with it and just accept what's going on and just get on with it. And again, just adopting that point of view. And there are a couple of stories in The Traveller that are like that. where the kids just, they're in a horrific situation, but they just accept it and go, and they just live.
Yeah, it must be difficult though. Is it hard to write stuff like that? Is it hard to like leave your office and become normal again when you're writing, hard subject matter like that?
I think it's not a coincidence that an awful lot of crime writers tend to be reasonably chill people, because they get a lot of that stuff out on the page. You
Cathartic.
It's cathartic, and you can kind of, it's a kind of a self-therapy a lot of the time. But it's also there have been occasions when I've gone to write something and I just couldn't. There was a subject matter I started to explore and then realized I couldn't put myself through it. And I mean, also, I think sometimes people think my books are more violent than they actually are in reality, because I don't often actually explicitly show the violence. Very often it's hinted at that it's something that exists in that background, in the world, in the background, rather than actually something that's explicitly on the page. So, for example, the story you're mentioning, the first story in The Traveller, we know the little boy is an abusive household, but we don't actually see the abuse firsthand. So although I'm talking about sometimes sort of desperately bad situations, I don't tend to often show that face on. It's normally something that you look at side on, which is easier then for me to write about, but also I think easier for the reader.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in kind of being salacious about that kind of thing, or exploitative or sadistic with that kind of thing. I'm more interested in the person that's going through it than the act itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because, you don't have to, be explicit about things, because if you paint such a picture, then the imagination of the reader is taken to that. It is in the detail. I mean, there was even one, I just noticed one part, something that I was reading, one of your stories, and it was he rubbed his sleeve. It was one of the thugs rubbed his sleeve, and the snot trail across his jacket. It's just like those tiny little things that the reader can really visualize exactly. So you don't need to put all of that thing in. There's a television show I watch called Mindhunter. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all of that is such. Just when you're talking about something like that, it's about serial killers, and all of. But there is no violence in it. It doesn't actually show anything, and yet people just have this image of this being a really violent show. But you don't need to do that to bring the imagination.
A specific example of that. I did an event in Derry Central Library. It's quite a while back, maybe 10 years ago now. I did it with Will McNamee, and it's my second book, and I did a reading from it. And it's a scene where a man sneaks into a house and kills another man, and it's maybe about 3-4 pages long. And after the event, a lady came up to me and she said she enjoyed the reading, but it was terribly violent. Your reading, there was awful violence in that. And I had to point out to her that over 4 pages there was one sentence of actual violence. Everything else was anticipation of it, and
that must have been
and the surrounding of it.
So that was a nice thing for you to hear, that you're able to conjure up these images without actually ever, actually saying it. But you can still manage to conjure up the images that are, what the story's supposed to be about. So,
well, it was gratifying, and that was my intention, that I succeeded in what I was trying to do. But it's, again, I've no interest in being sadistic or salacious in the writing. I'm more interested in the characters and how it impacts them, so emotionally and so on, rather than the actual physical violence itself.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's more about the aftermath and and using Northern Ireland as a backdrop to your stories, and recurring characters as well throughout your novels. Like, you really come to get to know these people, and you get to know this whole situation, the whole area, everything. It becomes like, the setting is part of your story, in all of your books. They say write what you know. I don't know if that's true, but obviously, Northern Ireland. Do you ever venture outside of that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I when I started writing, I was very, very resistant to the idea of writing about Northern Ireland, and very, very resistant to writing about the Troubles. And I wrote two novels that are still unpublished and will remain unpublished before the Ghosts of Belfast. One was set in Florida, where I've still never been, and the other was set in Manchester, where I did at least live for a couple of years. But then when the idea of the Ghost of Belfast presented itself, I knew it had to be set here. It couldn't be set anywhere else. And then that was the book that worked. That was the book that got a publishing deal. So I think that says something.
So you think it helps writing where you're from and where you know? I mean, I know you're a big fan of Stephen King, and he does that. I'm a big fan of Stephen King too, especially I used to read all his books. I haven't read anything recently, but when I was growing up, and he writes, all of his books are set in New England and Maine, New Hampshire, Maine, and that's where he's from. So did you take anything from that? You also used, just speaking of Stephen King, Halen Beck. He's done that as well. Did you get that idea from him?
Well, the idea of writing under a pen name, that was the Richard Bachman books. Stephen King used the name, but I came with the name Halen Beck. And those books were set in America.
Yeah.
Again, largely because they couldn't really be set anywhere else. The stories required that setting. The thing about writing American set stories, I think for us on this side of the Atlantic, I grew up as a kid watching Starsky and Hutch and the A-Team, and we still continue to absorb so much American culture and movies and TV and books and so on that it's not that difficult for somebody here to adopt that voice. So that doesn't feel like that big of a step to set something in the States, particularly as those books were set in parts of America that I know that I've been to and spent some time in. But again, it's having set those books in America. When I came back to write The House of Ashes, I think part of the reason it's such a Northern Irish book was as a reaction against having written a couple of books set in the States. Sorry, from your original question there.
No, but no, I don't even remember what my original question was there. I think I asked you two questions at the same time because I went off on a tangent. I was just thinking of Halen Beck, and I know, is it different? You're writing under a pen name. You're writing. Do you step outside yourself because they're two very different books? Set in different places and away from what you had been writing. Is that the reason why you chose to use a pen name? And does it feel different? Does it feel different as a writer?
Well, again, the first Halen Beck book, Here and Gone, like I said, it needed the idea of wilderness. It needed to be set somewhere with the kind of big sky and big stretches of open wilderness that we just don't have here. So the story itself necessitated the setting. And once I started writing it and I adopted that voice, which isn't that different, it's really just me with an American accent. The book was different enough that I thought it merited a pen name rather than doing it under my own name. Simply to avoid kind of confusion. And if I had it to do again, I probably wouldn't have used the pen name. I probably would have published it under my own name. But hindsight's a wonderful thing, as they say. But yeah, it was kind of, once I made that decision to use a different name, it was kind of liberating as well. I didn't have to fulfill any expectation of what my existing readers might have wanted from the book, So yeah, it was good in that sense. It freed me up in a lot of respects. And I did it for two books. Now that pen name is now dead and buried, as gone, and over with. So I got that out of my system now, but it was good. There are two books I'm still proud of. I still stand over. But as an experiment, it wasn't, I have to be honest, a huge success.
Yeah. Well, what about I know that Here and Gone was in development for a film. Is there anything happening with that, or is it still, or is it just put on hold?
It's I think the term for it's development hell. I was sent a screenplay a month or two back. That's actually a very good screenplay based on it. It's trundling along in production, but not like an awful lot of books that get optioned. It's going to sit at the bottom of somebody's drawer for a long time, and it more than likely won't ever see the light of day. it's an unfortunate reality. For every 100 books optioned, maybe one might get beyond development stage. It's not something I have any say or control over. So all I can do is put it out of my mind until somebody comes back and says they're actually doing something with it.
Yeah, because well, I mean, sure, that would be a very nice thing to happen. I'm sure that would help, but because I mean, you're obviously, you're well known. You've, as they say, you've made it now. So I'm sure it's you're doing well for yourself. But for people, for writing in general, I mean, it's very tough to make a living out of it when you're starting out. I'm sure. Did you find that at the beginning? And were you ever ready to throw in the towel? Or I mean, I suppose because your first book was so successful, maybe it wasn't like that for you.
It's a difficult question because every writer is different and every writer has a different career. I've known some writers who are very commercially successful but still keep their day jobs because they're able to do it. I personally was fortunate to be in a position financially where I could live off my writing, but I was also finding at the time I couldn't, because I was running a business at the same time. I was a partner in a business. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job, and I just found I couldn't juggle the two, and I had to make a choice, which was to go for the writing full time. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to make a living at it for more than 10 years now. But I know an awful lot of writers who sell decently and so on that don't make a living at it. It's really a difficult one. And everybody's different. Everybody has their own needs. Everybody has their own kind of threshold they need to cross in terms of income to be able to justify it. And so for me, I've been very, very fortunate that I've been able to do it now for more than 10 years. But it is a precarious existence to a large extent. In that there's no job security, but at the same time, who has job security these days? I think job security is kind of a thing of the past. But it's something that's a real sort of bugbear for me is the idea of the arts, whatever branch of the arts you're working in, being devalued as a career choice. When I was at school, I can say this in retrospect, I went to the Royal School in Armagh.
Yeah.
I can say this 30 odd years behind me, that the arts at that school at that time were viewed very dimly.
Well, I'm the same generation as you, so I think that it was pretty much around. I'm from Dublin, but so I think that was around. It was everywhere. I think I found the same thing myself. Yeah, it was like go and get a real job.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I mean, there are one or two teachers that did encourage me at school at the time in terms of writing and arts and so on. And it was music, writing, drawing, painting were my strong suits. And at the school I went to, if you weren't in the sciences, if you weren't in the sports, you were kind of nowhere. And the idea of the arts as a living was seen as fancy stuff. People from here don't make a living in the arts. No, they don't. Nobody does that for a living. But when I think about it now, I come from Armagh, and I think of people of my generation from the Armagh area that have gone on to make a living. I know more people that have gone on to make a living in the arts than I do that went on to become doctors or lawyers. You think of the Armagh area, there's Seamus McGarvey, Oscar-nominated cinematographer, just out the road. Dara Carville, very successful screenwriter. We've got Michael Hughes, actor, writer. We've got the young actor that was in Merlin, whose name has just escaped me.
Oh, yeah.
We've got Paul McNaney, very good friend of mine when I was growing up, runs Cahoots NI, very successful children's theatre group. I could go on and on. I could rattle off a dozen people that are from just the little hometown of Armagh that are now making a living in the arts. And we all consume art all day long, every day. If I get on a bus and see a billboard with an ad on it, that's there are arts behind that. If I turn on the TV, title sequences, music, acting, writing, everything that's there. We absorb art all day, every day, yet as a society, we put little value on it and we say it's not a proper job. I have consumed art constantly all there. Because I look around me in my room, there are book spines that people designed.
Yeah.
People in the arts designed those. There's art all around me. I couldn't tell you the last time I had to use a lawyer.
Yeah, that's
I've been to a
true.
doctor once in the last year.
Yeah.
People, we put a lot of value on things and very little value on other things. And the arts is one of those things that it annoys me when kids are told you can't be living in the arts.
Yeah.
When I know you can. And I think we, in schools and so on, we need to put more emphasis on that these are real careers that people can actually have. You don't have to live in London or New York or Los Angeles to have these careers. You can live in Armagh, County Armagh, you can live in Belfast, wherever, and have a career in the arts. Lots of people do.
Yeah, it's become more difficult.
I'm sure I got on that.
No, that's a very good point you're making, and but it has become much more difficult. I mean, I have a lot of friends that are in the arts, and things like music, Spotify. You're talking about undervaluing. It's like people are seem to be getting paid. It's harder and harder and harder to make a living in the arts, as you say, and yes, it's all around us. And even things like, big companies, like, I mean, I'm not putting down Amazon or anything, because, I know you're selling your books and all there, but we're looking at in Newry now, the only bookstore left in the city of Newry is Waterstones, is one Waterstones. Bookstores are just dwindling and vanishing. There's no record stores left in Newry at all, which is near where I'm from. It seems that everything is going online, and it's much more difficult for artists.
Music is the one that's taken the biggest hit of all, and I do think Spotify is evil. I'll be honest with you.
I think a lot of musicians would agree with you there. They're making pittance.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to that devaluing of the arts. I saw this years ago. I used to work in a music shop in Armagh, a guitar shop, and very often most of our customers were the guys who were going out and playing the pubs at weekends, that would have their drum machine and be singing a few covers in the corner of a pub, and they might get their 50 quid or 100 quid at the end of the night. And the number of times you'd be told that they're going to get paid, and the landlord would say, "Oh, we didn't have enough people in tonight, can't pay you." Would have said I'd pay you. And that used to drive me crazy. And I remember one person telling me they were told, "Actually, it's just a hobby. You don't need to get paid for that." And society in general devalues art to that extent that they think it's a hobby that's not something that anybody should get paid for, even though we consume it all the time, constantly. And that for me starts in education, but I think society in general needs to get to grips with that the arts are one of the most fundamental things in our day-to-day lives, yet we constantly say they have no worth. And when the government cuts arts funding and so on, I think we need to fight back against that, because we're depriving future generations of career paths and nurturing in that field. And there seems to be this huge disconnect between what people actually perceive as something that's just a hobby or something that's wishy-washy or a waste of time. And they don't make the connection between that and the advertising they see on the TV, or the design of the book covers they look at, of the design of the cars they drive, or the aesthetics of everything around them, of the music that's on the radio. The people don't seem to make that connection between the stuff they're seeing and hearing constantly through their daily lives and how that stuff actually gets made.
Yeah. And even Ireland has such a tradition. I mean, even in terms of tourism, I mean, traditionally, Ireland has been the place where the arts have thrived, if you look back, over the centuries. So, trying to become something that, more modern or whatever it is, commercial, capitalistic, I don't know what you call it, and not recognizing that this stuff is all around us, just in maybe different forms. I suppose it's something that really needs to be looked at. Yeah, and you say it starts from the schools.
Get ready to shake up summer with the Get Active ABC Sunshine Fill programme for kids and families. Get set for land-based adventure at our summer schemes, or why not get adventurous and maybe get wet at our Splashtastic Water Sports Summer programme. There are so many things to do, and all we need is you. See getactiveabc.com/summer for all the details.
But you yourself now, you're talking about the arts and what you do. You've got all your guitars behind you. Now tell us a bit about your band. Your band, the fun-loving criminals.
The Fun-Loving Criminals are a much more successful band than we are. We're the Fun-Loving Crime
The
Writers.
Fun-Loving Crime Writers, obviously. Yes, I don't know why that was in my head, because obviously the connection. Yeah. What is it? Murdering songs for fun?
Yeah, it started off as kind of a gag a few years back. There's a big international crime fiction festival called BoucherCon. It happens at a different city in America every year. And it was in New Orleans about 4 years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a band playing, and there was a function for all the writers, and there was a band playing. And at some point, it was me, Mark Billingham, and Doug Johnson, an American writer called Bill Ophel. And we somehow wound up on stage and bust our way through 3 songs and brought the house down. It went down so well. And a video started circulating online. Oh, that's somebody taken. And Mark got a phone call from the Edinburgh Festival of Books, as part of the Edinburgh Festival. I said, "Do you want a gig? Come and play the festival." And Mark foolishly said yes, before we actually had a band. And so then in a panic, we sort of called together anybody that we knew that could play. And we wound up in a rehearsal room in Liverpool with me on guitar, Mark Billingham, guitar and vocals, Doug Johnson on drums, Chris Brookmeyer, at that time on backing vocals, Val McDermott on vocals, and Luca Veste on bass, all of us crime writers. We started playing, and we got together, and I actually still thought this actually doesn't sound half bad. And we started pulling together lists of songs that involved crime and murder and misdeeds and bad behaviour. And we pulled together a set, and then we played, I think it would be the summer before, years ago, this summer we played the Edinburgh Festival, our first ever gig. And it went down brilliantly. Had a huge response to it, and it kind of took on a life of its own then. Pretty much every literary festival we wound up playing at over a few years, which culminated in us playing in Glastonbury in 2019, the last Glastonbury there was for the time being. And
had you been to Glastonbury before?
I hadn't. I'm not a festival goer. As big as I am into music, I was never really into festivals. So yeah, that was an experience in itself, playing at Glastonbury, and it went really well. And we were going great guns. Everything was going fantastically well with that until obviously 2020 and everything that's happened over the last 18 months or so brought all that to a halt. We are thankfully starting to talk about gigs now and before the end of this year again. So hopefully, touch wood, things will start to come back and we can start playing again. Yeah.
Where do you get the time? You turn out like a book a year, right? More or less.
Yeah. I'm supposed to. Don't necessarily always manage that.
Well, more or less. I mean, you kind of pretty much have. And so what would your schedule be? Do you get up in the morning? I mean, you must be very disciplined. Do you have your office? Do you go have your cup of tea in the morning and then sit down and write? Or do you have to have inspiration, or what way does it work?
In theory, now, again, the pandemic has kind of messed things up a lot for me. In that I would normally have my routine of doing the school run in the morning, getting the kids to school, come back home, getting a cup of tea, sitting down at the computer, and in theory starting to write. Didn't always work out every day like that, but for the most part that was the way it went. Or sometimes I would go to my local library with a laptop and write if I really want to concentrate. And that's the way it's normally worked, but unfortunately the pandemic with homeschooling and...
Yeah, what age are your kids now? They'd be, what, 11 and...
Uh, 7 and 9, about to turn 8 and 10.
8 and 10, right.
Last week. So they've been at home for most of the last year, so that's kind of disrupted my workflow, unfortunately, and it's been difficult to try and establish a routine again. But hopefully, as things settle down, I'll get back into that routine of just sort of, it's fairly regular daily routine of school run, breakfast, sit down to work, pick the kids up again, that kind of thing. You know, it's.
So would you just sit there with your blank piece of paper and does it just come to you? Or I suppose you're absorbed in the story, so do you know where it's going next? When you write a book, do you have the story already planned out in your head of where it's going to go, or does it happen as you write?
You could ask 100 writers this question, you'll get 100 different answers. Yeah. Everybody's different. For me, I find I need a point of departure and a point of destination. Okay. I need to know where the story starts. I need to know where it's going to end up, and pretty much everything in between is up for grabs, really. Sometimes if I'm feeling very methodical about it, I'll maybe map out a couple of chapters ahead of myself, but never really any more than that. I usually have some idea of the arc of the story of roughly, I tend to think in a 3-act structure. I have roughly an idea what the 3 acts, the shape of them is going to be. But even that can radically change in the course of writing the book. Yeah. I have had several occasions where when I've literally been on the page as writing, the stories could take a complete left turn and gone somewhere completely different. So but I've always wound up with the same ending I always intended. So those two things, I need that point to set off from, I need that point to end up, and then really everything in between is just a matter of sitting down and churning it out word by word.
Yeah. And for the traveller now, because it's short stories, I suppose that's a different thing. Some of your endings, actually, some of them were very clever. Definitely, I'm not going to give anything away, but there was one story in particular that had took a very interesting turn. Was the one with the woman whose husband was terminally ill, or he was dying, and there was the euthanasia. I really like the way that went, the way it ended. Is writing short stories different? How hard is that now, writing short stories? I've heard something somewhere before that writing a short story can be just as hard as writing a novel. Even people think because it's short, but it's a much more different thing.
I don't think you can really compare the two. They're very different formats, and you can do very different things with them. I find there's very often a lot more freedom with a short story. I can take a chance and do things that I couldn't do in a novel. Which very often you find sometimes my short stories will be a lot darker than the novels are, because you can go places where maybe a reader wouldn't follow you. In a novel, they will for a short story, because they don't have to sort of marry themselves in it for so long. And the story you mentioned is a good example. The short story is called Faith, but that actually became a novel called So Say the Fallen. I turned that into a novel, but it's quite different, has an entirely different ending, and goes somewhere very different with the character of the wife in that story. She becomes somebody very, very different in the novel. Okay. And that can be an interesting comparison, what you'll do with something that's maybe 5,000 words as opposed to something that's 80,000 words.
Yeah.
And I find where short story is very good is allowing you to have kind of a sideways glance at something. With a novel, you have to really look at and examine your theme, your subject, and really pick it apart. Whereas in a short story, you can just dip in and dip out, if that makes sense. You can visit a subject without having to really pull it apart.
Yeah.
There's a story in there called The Green Lady, which is based on a local kind of legend from the Folly area of Armagh. And because it's a short story, it doesn't really have to explain anything.
Mm-hmm.
Things in the story just happen and they roll out and the story concludes, but there's no need to really pull
out. I found that one very scary, yeah.
And and because it's a short story, there's no need to explain any of it. There's no need to kind of go into the words or whys or wherefores. You can just let the story exist as it exists. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to justify itself. If that makes sense, you don't have to.
Because it's just like a moment in time. You're pulling out a moment. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what it is. Another way to look at it is, this is going to sound very terribly pretentious. A short story is looking through the keyhole, whereas the novel is opening the door.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way of putting it. Actually, that's true, because you really are. Yeah. You're going into the whole character and the whole world when you're in a novel, but in a short story, you're just taking a little chunk out of something. Yeah. And which do you prefer writing, or do you have? I assume you've written more novels, so do you find it harder to write short stories, or easier? Is it just?
No, they don't take as long as I can write a short story in a weekend, whereas a novel takes a year. But in terms of difficulty, they're much of a muchness. And I like doing both. I mean, the stories in The Traveller, there's about 10 years worth of stories in that book.
Yeah.
So, it's not that one is easier or more difficult. They're just different. And I like both of them equally. I like writing short stories. I like that brief kind of hit. And not having the commitment of having to stay with the story for a year. At the same time, you don't get to delve in the same way you do with a novel.
Yeah.
And I've always liked both as a reader as well. I mean, we mentioned Stephen King. I've always felt that some of his best work is his short stories and his novellas.
Yeah.
Rather than the big store-stop novels. It's things like The Body, which became Stand By Me, the movie.
Oh yeah, it's great.
It's a great movie. It was a great novella as well. And it's a very compact.
But I find a lot of his stuff doesn't translate to the screen as well as, well, he famously hated The Shining, didn't he? Although I don't really understand why The Shining was great. But a lot of his books, an awful lot of his books were brought to the screen and didn't really work as well. You really need to immerse yourself in his books, I think.
Well, I think it's his shorter work that was translated better. So The Body being a novella, translated well. Shawshank Redemption, again, was a novella from the same collection.
True,
works as a movie. I think Carrie works as a movie because it's a really short novel. And Misery, I think, is possibly one of the best adaptations. Again, it's quite a tight, short novel. So I think his shorter stuff translates better to the screen. But a lot of film people said about short stories in general, it's easier to adapt a short story.
Yeah. Well, because there's so much in a novel. Yeah. You can't fit a novel into, an hour and a half or 2 hour movie in general. But another one of your fans, James Elroy, who had written a review of The 12. He, your writing style, the noir. I love the way you have like these like sort of short sentences. You can almost hear the Dick Tracy, in your writing. You can hear the voice of that. But interesting, I was reading something about him, and he was he does that very thing. He has these like short sentences, that go to the point. It's a very crimey sort of thing. But apparently, it was because he was told to shorten his books. So he just took out all the unnecessary words because they were too long. His publicist said his books are too long, so he just took out words. So that was an accident. But your writing style is very distinctive. Is that something you've just comes naturally to you, or something you want?
I think it's. I think in my earlier books, I think you'll see more of the James Elroy influence. Particularly the first and second books. There's that kind of staccato style where everything's very short and snappy, and Dennis Lehane as well will be another writer that I take that from. I think I've moved away from that as the books have gone on. I think of the influence is less obvious, and of maybe taking more influence from somebody like Megan Abbott.
I can actually see Cormac McCarthy in there, I have to say.
Yeah. Cormac McCarthy as well. Again, he was somebody I was reading a lot of at the time. I was writing those early books, and you see that everything's very punchy and tight, and not a lot of description. I have changed since then. My writing's changed since then, I think. But it's interesting, the short story collection, because that covers a range of, I think the stories in there are from about 2008 through to 2020.
Yeah.
You can see a range of stories, a range of styles in that book. You can see the change possibly in that if you say The Catastrophist, I think, is one of the later stories in that. And if you compare that to Queen of the Hill, which was the earliest stories in that, if you read those two stories back to back, you would see quite a difference.
Is that do you do that on purpose, or is that just a natural progression of your style?
I think it's just an evolution of it. And also, all writers are a product of their reading, as my reading has changed.
And what would you read nowadays?
The last book I really enjoyed was it was a graphic novel by this guy, holding a picture of him, Adrian Tomine, Japanese American writer. It's called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist, which I really enjoyed. I've read some Shirley Jackson lately, which I've been really enjoying. She wrote The Haunting of Hill House. I've enjoyed that. And I think you'll see that reflected maybe in The House of Ashes. And Megan Abbott, I'm a huge fan of still. And and I've been going back. I've been reading outside crime. I'm less likely to read crime than I used to be. I'm more likely to go back to something like a Western or that sort of thing. Just things that are. A book I really enjoyed recently was Whiskey When We're Dry, and then the author's name has completely escaped me. But anyway, I'm much less like crime nowadays.
Yeah, I don't know how you find the time to read, because you seem to be such a busy person with your music and your writing and your kids and your it's all go. Yeah,
it's getting time to sleep in the middle of all that can be the difficulty.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think our time is going to run out here on our Zoom call. So it's been really, really nice talking to you, Stuart, and it's been a pleasure. And I really am looking forward to reading House of Ashes now, because I thought The Traveller was great. I highly recommend it to anybody.
Just might as well get a plug in. The Traveller is coming out in paperback in UK and Ireland early next month. You probably won't see it in the supermarkets, but you should hopefully see it in Waterstones and places like that.
Well, we have to keep buying all our stuff in Waterstones and keep our bookstores open. I think. And No Alibis in Belfast has been a big supporter of mine. If you can get down there on Botanic Avenue, and there's Bridge Books in Dromore. No, it's where those independent bookstores are still out there, and I've always been very supportive of me. So I'd like to, if you can buy from an independent bookstore, if you have one within distance, get to, then please buy books there if you can. Keep them open. Yeah, and I hope that we'll see you out. The fun-loving crime writers back out there on the stage, rocking all the festivals. Hopefully. I was trying to. I wasn't giving you fingers. I was trying to cross my fingers. I actually looked at some. Hopefully. I hope, and it's been a difficult year for everybody, or 18 months for everybody. I'm hoping maybe by autumn time we can take to the stage again. See everybody. Yeah. All right. Thanks a million, Stuart. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you. Likewise.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Stuart there as much as I enjoyed chatting with him. And I definitely encourage you, if you haven't already, to go out and get some of his books, because they really are fantastic. Remember to keep getting all of your news from Armagh, and I hope you join us next time for our podcast.
From the
I don't know what to say. I'm just speechless.
To the
I can't believe it.
we see all sorts of life-changing moments at McKinney Competitions. How would you react? Cars, houses, tech bundles and more from just £2 a ticket. No purchase necessary. For competitions, rules and conditions, see mckinneycompetitions.com.